Notebook 12. Misery on the Champagne Front. From the 13th of July, 1916, to the 29th of August, 1916. Part 1. Last time we saw how Barthas and his comrades settled into life on the Champagne Front. Here Barthas officially recovered his rank of corporal. He got a new squad made up of juvenile delinquents and his old friend Paul Alpert, and, together with the rest of the Palus, worked hard in the trenches while the terrifying threat of gas warfare loomed over them, and there was practically nothing they could do about it. We finished that notebook just as Barthas had volunteered for a special training assignment at the Bowie farm, in order to escape for a few days from the clutches of the regiment's new, insufferable Colonel Robert. We shall now see what happened there. As was said on the last episode, here at the farm Barthas saw Russian soldiers for the first time, part of an expeditionary force sent to France. The Russians came to rest at a nearby village and wandered around the place despite rules that supposedly forbid this. Additionally, an order had been issued in the region that forbid the selling of alcoholic beverages to Russian soldiers, but Barthas said that one quick glance at them was all that one needed to know that this order was also being ignored. The happy Russians walked unsteadily through the streets in erratic zigzags while singing and laughing. Occasionally a Russian would suddenly kneel before a pretty woman on the street and give what were clearly elaborate and passionate declarations of love in his foreign tongue. The people of Bowie were indulgent and entertained by these harmless drunks. The day after the Palus' arrival, the 14th of July, was Bastille Day, the French National Day. There was practically nothing to distinguish this day from any other besides a supplemental ration of wine. The soldiers received no rest, and their training began that very day. It turned out they would be trained in the operation of a new French 37mm cannon. It looked like a French 75mm in miniature, and the instructor praised how it had a high rate of fire and could be operated by 2 men. It was meant to destroy machine gun nests, observation posts, and other structures. Barthas wrote that all of the Palus looked at the gun and its small shell with disdain. Their training was intense, with both firing exercises and classes on theory that stuffed their heads with geometry. Barthas wrote that eventually, after 12 days of training, they had all been turned into pretty good gunners. There was a little bit of comedy from a corporal from the 114th Regiment who could not pronounce words and fire commands correctly despite his very best efforts. But Barthas himself was worried with other things, as during those days he suddenly fell very ill. He lost all appetite, his eyes reddened and burned, spots broke on his throat, one of his lips swelled, and for 2 days he could barely stand up. He told his instructor lieutenant about this, but the annoyed man told him that he would have to walk many kilometers to find an infirmary, and that, given his short stay in the farm, he would be better off simply sticking it out. And so Barthas spent those miserable days at the farm, his stomach accepting nothing but the water of dubious quality that was available there. Later, one evening, he finally recovered a bit of his appetite, and he decided to go to the nearby village of Mourmelon-le-Grand to find something to eat. He was told it was a half-hour away, just at the other side of a nearby hill. But Barthas soon found out that there were actually 3 or 4 hills in the way, and the journey took him over 4 hours. When he arrived completely exhausted, he found the lively town full of French army support units and Russian soldiers. He entered a restaurant which tried to squeeze every penny out of him, but which allowed him to have a meal which consisted of 2 eggs, a salad, and some fruit, which helped him greatly. When he finished eating, twilight had already fallen, and he quickly made his way to go back to the farm, but was stopped for a while as a Russian regiment made its way through the street, on its way to the trenches. Barthas commented how the regiment marched in ranks that were 10 or 12 men wide. At their lead marched the Russian officers intoning religious songs, and at the front of each company marched ranks of little Russian kids that went from 10 to 15 years old. These kids served their regiment as couriers, cyclists, drummers, and pot cleaners, among many other duties. And Barthas commented that the older Russian soldiers treated them like their own adopted children. After the column passed, Barthas quickly went on his way down the road and back to the farm. Unfortunately, night enveloped everything and he soon lost his way. Barthas wrote of how in his sick and exhausted state he suddenly lost consciousness. All thought simply ceased and he fell on the road. He was eventually woken up by the cold night and finally arrived at his barracks at 11 p.m., but soon discovered that his absence had barely been noticed. It turned out that at one of the taverns in the neighboring town of Bowie, a brawl had broken out between some soldiers from Barthas' own 296th Regiment and some grenadiers and soldiers from other regiments. Barthas wrote that this unfortunate incident was due to distrust and hostility between the inhabitants of southern France and those of other parts of France, which was not uncommon. Barthas' 296th Regiment was from southern France, while the others at the Bowie farm were not. Usually things were limited only to insinuations and occasional insults, but this time alcohol had made things get much more serious. Not only fists, but clubs were also used, and in the brawl one of the northern French soldiers had been knocked unconscious, while two of the southern soldiers of the 296th had their faces terribly beaten. Hostility was thick in the air that night. In their barracks, Barthas and his Occitan comrades were a minority, and despite the fact that the main brawlers belonged to another billet, they all faced harassment from the other soldiers. They were mocked, threatened, insulted, and even a few rocks were thrown their way. Barthas and his comrades received all of this stoically and went to sleep. But as soon as they got into bed, the other soldiers started jumping around them and forcing them to get up. Before all this harassment, Barthas and his comrades went outside and slept that night under the starry sky. By July 21st, their training was complete, and the soldiers would soon return to their respective regiments. But before that, they had to carry out a demonstration as new combat companies were formed with everything from grenadiers, machine gunners, bomb throwers, and 37mm cannons, among many others. A small army of commandants and captains from all the regiments involved arrived to witness this. Among them, the star was General Henri Gouraud, who in 1915 had lost his arm and broken his legs during the Gallipoli campaign, but who now commanded the French Fourth Army in Champagne. All the officers gathered around him and tried to please him in any way they could. Barthas wrote that the demonstration itself, like all their drills, was carried out perfectly. The night before, they had already been made to plot all the targets that would be involved in it. After that, the general delivered a speech in which he spoke of how the rifle was now an obsolete weapon, replaced by the new tools of war like artillery, flamethrowers, and machine guns. And he talked of how the German people were completely demoralized and how victory was assured and imminent. The officers listened with rapt attention and clapped with great enthusiasm. Barthas and the other Palus were very skeptical of all of this. Additionally, the general added one detail in his speech that the soldiers fully believed in, and which caused them great worry. The general spoke of how the Battle of the Somme was raging, and how it would soon be the turn of the soldiers of the Fourth Army to take a share of the glory and honor in it. After all that, the general and all the other officers got onto their cars and disappeared, leaving the soldiers to make their way back to the Bowie farm under a strong sun, dragging their heavy weapons and cannons with them. Then, on July 22nd, the Palus left the farm to rejoin their regiment, which a few days previously had moved into a new sector at the town of Perthé-le-Houlou, still within the Champagne region. After a journey by truck, then on a railway, and finally by foot, the Pelouse reached the divisional depot near the town of Somme-Suip. It turned out they had arrived after the evening meal, and the depot did not have any food to give them. It also did not have any place to lodge them, and that night Barthas had to sleep under a cart. The Pelouse Lieutenant Loriot had told them that due to their training with a new cannon, they would certainly be kept at the depot instead of being risked on the front line, but this turned out to be false. They immediately received orders to go rejoin their units at the trenches the following morning. Filthy and undersupplied as the depot was, the Pelouse still preferred it over the dangers of the trenches. But there was nothing that could be done, and they departed at dawn, crossing a region that was known as the lousy Champagne due to its poor soil. Barthas described the lousy Champagne as a desolate place that resembled more of a desert than anything else, with nothing more than a few stunted pine trees growing there. Eventually, at nightfall, Barthas found his squad of juvenile delinquents at an observation post. The kids were joyous at his return, and Barthas was deeply touched by the warm reception, though they all had to be careful to not make much noise, as the Germans were but a few steps away. Then, exhausted, Barthas lay down on the firing step and tried to rest. It turned out that the squads had to take turns keeping watch at the outposts by twos. One squad spent 24 hours standing guard, while the other squad spent 24 hours in a nearby hole in the main trench that served as shelter. Then they switched. Barthas wrote that this arrangement would have been fine for the most part, but there were some problems. To begin with, whatever superior had designed this had made the awful decision of setting the reliefs to take place at midnight instead of at noon, so each squad had 2 nights split in half instead of a full night of rest. It was easy for the officers, as they could sleep all they wanted, but if a soldier fell asleep, he risked a court-martial. Additionally, Barthas was angered at how their superiors had decided to have a full squad manning each observation outpost at the same time, instead of only posting a pair of sentinels and having the rest of the squad a bit farther behind. With a full squad packed in this way, if a single grenade or shell fell into the outpost, it could easily kill the whole squad, at least a dozen men. These were all basic problems which their superiors couldn't identify or solve after 2 years of trench war. Barthas wrote of how it was incredible how their superiors could be so close to their soldiers, yet so disconnected from reality. And so Barthas and his squad stood watch at the outpost and were relieved at midnight. Then they headed to their shelter for rest. For comfort and beds, the hole had nothing more than a floor of wooden planks, which at least was something compared to the damp ground, though it was not helped by the fact that the shelter was completely infested with fleas and lice that constantly bit them, and the planks themselves had been nailed in such a haphazard fashion that whenever someone moved in the shelter, the planks went up and down like piano keys, disturbing their sleep. Besides this, there were many other things that made rest practically impossible. The possibility of a gas attack in the sector was real and constantly hung over the soldiers' heads. It made it so the soldiers had to post a sentry that had to stand watch outside the shelter through a camouflaged periscope to warn if the gas was coming. It was planned so that after an hour had passed, the sentry would be relieved by the next sentry. But still there were difficulties. When they arrived exhausted at the shelter, no one wanted to be the first sentry on duty. Everyone gave excuses, and it led to long discussions. Additionally, the sentry would always return to the shelter and try to wake up his relief a good 10 minutes before his hour was up. And the sleeping man, who also did not want to go outside, would pretend to not hear him. So the sentry would have to repeat his call 3 or 4 times, louder and louder each time, awakening everyone in the shelter. The section chief also liked to sleep in his own shelter with a sentinel standing guard at his entrance, and so, each night, Barthas had to supply him with one of his men for this. Besides this, there were also the work details. During what was supposed to be their rest period, any superior was free to send them on work details, and so it was rare that 2 hours passed without a messenger or a sergeant arriving at the shelter and waking up the soldiers in it, so that the corporal would choose 2 or 3 men to be sent out in search of supplies, grenades, ammunition, and sandbags, and often sending the corporal along with them. Unsurprisingly, every time men were chosen for work details, there would be a chorus of angry protests. And of course, every time the exhausted soldiers returned from their outpost duty at midnight, they also had to send a group of them through the dark maze of trenches to haul heavy barrels of water for the commandant and the captain. Barthas wrote of how the poilus often did not have a single drop of water to drink, but the officers, their orderlies, and other rear echelon personnel loved to bathe every day. Meanwhile, the days were just as busy and exhausting as the nights were, offering no opportunity to sleep or rest. That very first night at the shelter, Barthas had barely closed his eyes when he was awoken by an angry lieutenant from another company, who had just caught the shelter's sentry asleep at his post. This was one of the young soldiers of Barthas' squad, a young orphan Breton called Maurice Yver, who had proudly shown Barthas a picture of his pretty Breton girlfriend as soon as he'd arrived. The young man had fallen asleep from fatigue, and was now completely disoriented and overwhelmed by the furious officer. Falling asleep as a sentry was a very serious offense and risked a court-martial. Barthas tried to explain how the soldier was just a young and exhausted orphan, and how his duty there was more akin to that of an orderly than a sentry, but the lieutenant did not listen and left fuming. The next day the military authorities delivered their punishment on the young soldier. Barthas wrote how the army couldn't simply give the sentries prison time because in all likelihood, if they did so, all the sentries would intentionally fall asleep at their posts to escape the trenches and go into the luxury of a prison cell. They did not give the young Yver a death penalty directly. Instead, they decided to make use of him. A French gas attack was being prepared in the sector. The earthworks for launching the gas had already been dug, and the officers were creating what they called a free section, composed of men that would have to go out into no man's land with gas masks of dubious quality, to report the effects and lethality of the gas on the German positions. This unit was composed almost entirely of poilus who had been punished, together with a few men that had been fooled with the promise of a medal, a promotion, or simply of home leave. And so the young Maurice Yver was pulled out of the squad and sent to train with the free sections for the gas attack. Besides this, he also got 2 weeks of prison for the principle of it. The next midnight, Barthas' squad was sent to stand watch at the new observation outpost. As dawn was breaking, the sentry at the periscope suddenly called Barthas. The man looked scared, and when he looked through the periscope, Barthas saw why. The periscope was hidden behind some grass, and through it they could see to their shock the face of a huge German emerge from the ground barely 5 meters away from them and among the barbed wire. It was obvious the Germans had dug a subterranean tunnel from their own positions. The sentry prepared a grenade, but Barthas stopped him. Barthas wrote that he would always follow his principles as a Christian, a socialist, and a humanitarian to not attack someone unless in true self-defense. Besides this, he also did not wish to break the unspoken truce and good relations that had developed between the French and German soldiers in the sector. If the German had only come out to look around, they would do nothing. And so, soon after, the German disappeared back into his tunnel, and they did not see him again. The next night passed without any incident, though it was pitch black. The wind rattled the barbed wire, and the rats moved all around the place in the darkness. This, combined with the discovery of the German and his tunnel the previous day, made Barthas's terrified rookies shoot and throw grenades at shadows, with Barthas having to stop them each time to prevent a general alarm spreading throughout the sector. Later, on the night of July 26th, they were relieved and sent 7 kilometers to the rear to occupy a place known as Camp A, in the middle of the desolate, lousy Champagne. Barthas commented that the beds there were bunk beds. The first ones to arrive took the lower levels, while the others, including Barthas, had to take the upper ones. The young rookies climbed up easily, though Barthas only managed to get up with the help of a neighbor. The nights were freezing and the days scorching hot, but overall it was not so bad. Besides that, a few hundred meters away from the camp, there was a ravine with some ruins known as the Forester's Cabin. This place had been famous in the newspapers as a place of intense fighting during the 1915 offensive in Champagne, and it now hosted a vast graveyard of tiny crosses. Barthas wrote that the whole of the lousy Champagne was not worth a single drop of all the blood that had been spilled for it. At the bottom of the ravine there was also a watering post, where a territorial always stood guard. Only war details with a non-commissioned officer carrying a written order could take water from there. The soldiers could go and drink there to quench their thirst, but they were not allowed to get water to wash their filthy clothes. For that, one had to bribe or distract the territorial during the night. Though Barthas wrote that the territorial's price was cheap, all Barthas needed was to give him a cheap cigar to finally get enough water to do his laundry. In Camp A there was also precious little to eat, as the supply trucks did not dare to get so close to the front line. Some Palus loaded themselves with jerrycans to go out into the nearby villages in search of wine and food. But at every crossroads there stood the gendarmes, the pitiless military police that would send the soldiers back after writing down their names and numbers. Every day at roll call, these soldiers that had only been looking for some wine or cheese after serving in the trenches would be punished with days in prison. One of the more noteworthy cases was a corporal from Barthas's company, who tried to get through the policemen by forging an order and the commandant's own signature. The trick was discovered, and the upper ranks were scandalized, with talk of a court-martial, breaking in rank, forced labor, and even more, though somehow the corporal miraculously pulled himself out of that mess. Still, the zealous gendarmes generated nothing but anger in the poilus, some of which went out in groups with clubs and gave the gendarmes lessons through a few hard knocks. One day in particular, 2 gendarmes were found in a sorry state, swinging in the air tied to branches with rope. After that, the poilus were free to go and get food from the nearby towns. The higher-ups were moved by this incident, and for the next 3 days at roll call, the poilus were read over and over of the difficult and selfless job that the gendarmes had to carry out. A voice among the soldiers said that if the gendarmes thought their jobs were tough and thankless, then they should try going out to an outpost. Even the officers couldn't repress their laughter at this and other sarcastic remarks. All in all, they spent 4 days in Camp A. The last day, a couple of shells fell about 200 meters away, which indicated that the Germans were aware of the camp's existence and had only missed due to an error in their calculations. On the 30th of July, the poilus were sent again to the trenches as reserve. They were stationed at what had originally been a German trench, with large concrete emplacements and many shelters. They passed an enormous mine crater that could have hidden 1,000 men. That crater had been the witness of savage fighting and was now full of debris of all kinds, like barbed wire, grenades, and broken rifles. Another tragic yet minuscule part of the war. This place also had an enormous rat infestation, and every night while the Palus tried to sleep, the rodents would appear and walk all over them, chattering and trying to eat all that was inside their packs. The soldiers soon found out to their great disgust that the rats came from a nearby cemetery for German soldiers. The place was full of burrows, from which emanated a noxious smell that indicated that the vermin complemented their diets by feeding on the dead. During their stay on those reserve lines, the men also had to form teams and take turns, day and night, going to the front lines to help the engineers in mine tunneling duty. This was truly hellish work in deep and labyrinthian underground tunnels. Barthas and his squad had to work hauling heavy loads of planks, beams, and other construction material from the rear lines to the mine entrance, and then they had to enter the mines and go right behind the working miners, filling sacks with all the dirt and rocks that were dug up, and then dragging them back to a landing in the tunnels and filling up a mine wagon, which was then lifted up into the light with a winch, where that dirt and rock would later be spread outside the trenches at night. The work was exhausting, and in several parts the tunnels were so low that the workers and soldiers were forced to move on hands and knees. All the men dripped with sweat as they had to pass the sacks from one to the other down the line. Some of the tunnels were several hundred meters long, and it could take over 20 minutes to pass a sack of rocks from the miners to the wagon. One night, Barthas was working with his squad in those galleries when a chilling alarm was passed down the tunnels. Gas attack. Immediately, everyone in the tunnels scrambled in panic to try and get out, and in the chaos, the candles that lit the tunnel were turned over, submerging the mine in total darkness. Soon, Barthas found himself completely lost in the dark labyrinth together with 2 or 3 other men. Fortunately, it turned out that all of this had been a false alarm given by the officers to test the readiness of the sector. If it had been real, the gas would have easily filled up the tunnels, and they would have died then and there. A short while after, some engineers searched the tunnels and found Barthas and the others. Still, there was one problem with all of this, as Barthas' squad of juvenile delinquents had taken advantage of the alarm to run as far away as they could, and so Barthas could not finish his assigned work. The officer of engineers reported this, and Barthas got into some trouble. Lieutenant Breton told him that the only thing that saved him from being broken in rank again had been his excellent conduct on Hill 304, which Barthas reiterated in his diary had not been particularly spectacular at all. And so, life continued. Later, on the 4th of August, at 8 in the evening, Barthas and his comrades were sent to the front line, and they went there almost with pleasure, as it meant no longer having to work in the mines or suffer the graveyard rats. But we shall see what happened at the front line on the next episode. For now, we have finished this part of the 12th notebook, with all its sobering scenes of the misery of trench life, and the promise of a general that they'll soon go to the Battle of the Somme. I hope you all have a good day, and I shall see you next time.